Hello, welcome back to American Reconquista. I'm your host, Emilio Pons. Tonight I'm joined by one of my closest friends in the world, Frank Mathis. It's a pleasure to speak tonight to a friend rather than just yet another expert on a very specific topic, simply because Frank and I go back a few years by now, and the topic that we're going to be discussing today is one that has been recurrent in our conversations. And that's mainly the threats that Western civilization faces nowadays. These threats being cultural Marxism, wokeism, critical theory, identity politics, postmodernism and deconstructivism, radical feminism, gender ideology, radical environmentalism and anti-humanism, anti-nationalism and globalism, woke capitalism and corporate social engineering, technocratic authoritarianism and the surveillance state, and finally, Islam. So, Frank, thank you very much for being here. And
thank you for inviting me.
How do you see these threats having manifested themselves over the past 4 years during the Biden administration?
Well, people only think about themselves. They think specifically about themselves. When they do think about other people, it's about what other people are doing to me. People owe me something, and I'm not getting it, and therefore it's your fault. It's white people's fault. It's anybody's fault but my fault. And that was basically supported and backed by the Biden administration. I think people have lost a sense of connection to mankind as a whole. They've lost a sense of love. They've lost a sense of connection to their fellow man. They don't love themselves, so they have trouble looking at another person and having any sense of reverence or respect for them. So they project that hate of themselves, which they hold deep inside, they project that onto the rest of the world. I think that's what we're seeing, on top of the other topics. But I think at base, it's a psychological issue, and it's mass psychosis across the board.
There's definitely an element of mass psychosis brought about by the indoctrination that we have seen is going on at the universities in this country that are no longer really centers of higher learning, but rather centers of ideological indoctrination into Marxism, critical race theory, and all this nonsense.
Which I think they always were, but what happened, I think, in the early 2000s, the late aughts, early 2000s, was that all of the ideologies that were being studied in the university began to pour out into the general public, and it began to pour out into political organizing. So then everything that was happening in the ivory tower became extant and available to people.
Right. I would agree with you, and some of the authors of the books that I want to recommend to our viewers tonight would agree as well. Short for one of them, Richard Hanania, who wrote The Origins of Woke, would disagree, but we'll talk about that later. He believes that the origins of woke are to be found in government and in the law, and the approach of the last decades. Okay, let's talk specifically about cultural Marxism and neo-Marxism. I think that a lot of people are still enamored with the idea of Marx being some sort of revolutionary figure that fought against the oppressors. And I think that this speaks this resonates very clearly and directly with the American public, particularly with the young. Why? Because in my opinion, this nation is comprised actually of genuinely nice people, very loving and caring people who always care for one another, in spite of the portrayal of the American as being incredibly individualistic and selfish. There is that generalized will to help others, and particularly those who are in need the most.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
And
you even see it in a place like New York, which is so tough and everything else, but we love to help each other. We really care about each other.
And so I think that there's this American obsession that is dangerous, that always ends up backfiring, with two things: helping the underdog, and siding intuitively with the underdog in whatever circumstance. And the other thing that typically backfires is this notion that we are all equal. And I think that this notion has been misconstrued to mean that we are all equal by fiat, de facto, in terms of our intelligence, discipline, grit,
we all have equal
industriousness.
qualities.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We don't
Which is
have
just not the case.
these equal qualities. Nobody does. And it's very easy to recognize them when we are talking about, I don't know, physical attributes like height, right? Nobody would dare say that we are equally tall, right? And if I were to say, well, I want to be a star of the NBA, I would be laughed out of the room because at 5'6", it's just never going to happen. Actually, I'm really like 5'5", but whatever. 5'6" officially on my passport.
For the record.
For the record. It's never going to happen. But as soon as we talk about other features that are a little bit more taboo, because they tend to be then connected to socio-economic, cultural, and God forbid, ethnic factors, all of a sudden we cannot talk about differences that are so clearly there.
Because
right?
people project values on them that don't exist.
Correct. And so this is a big issue. This is a reason why all these threats have one thing in common, and that is trying to bring about by force equality amongst unequals. And all these threats tend to forget that we already are equal in this society under the law, and that's the only type of equality that I care for, right? All that I care about is that I be subject to the same laws, the same rules, and the same standards as anybody else, whether it's the President of the United States or, a worker of the MTA.
Absolutely.
Right?
What's
That's
expected
the
of you
equality.
is expected of
Exactly.
me.
That's the only equality that should matter. But in fact, when we discuss these topics, we see that people have manipulated the language to no longer talk about equality, but rather equity, right? Which is nothing other than equality of outcomes. And given the fact that we are not all the same, we're not equally intelligent, not equally industrious, not equally agreeable, sociable, educated, etc., the only way to do that and to bring about that equality of outcomes is by lavishing undue credit and opportunities upon people who don't deserve them, in detriment, obviously, of those who do. They do it always under the guise of seeking a better future, a more just and equitable society, etc.
Also in detriment to the people to whom they're lavishing these things upon.
Correct.
People who don't have the skill set, they don't have the outlook, they don't have the equal whatever, are absolutely destroyed for it. They're made worse for it.
Correct. So let's look a little bit about, talk a little bit about the origins of cultural Marxism and neo-Marxism. Why do we call them neo-Marxism? Well, traditional Marxism focused on class struggle, right? The struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. And it basically posited that the proletariat was inherently and inevitably oppressed by those who were in power, and above all, those who had control over the means of production, right? And it created this ridiculous notion that in order to exist, these bourgeois classes relied on the exploitation of the poor.
Right.
And
It's
that
always a
without the
zero-sum
war,
game.
that it was a zero-sum game. And that without the poor, what they had to bring onto the table literally was meaningless. The Marxists, however, did not take into account a few key things. First of all, that it is precisely the bourgeoisie, or rather those who are owners of industries, services, and whatnot, that risk their capital into creating these enterprises. Without that capital that is being risked, there is no value to be created. Number one.
Yep.
And number two, that thing that you create, its value is all contingent also on context, right? Maybe, you think as a laborer that whatever it is that you're creating, be it a bottle of water or a car, has a predetermined value, but it actually is very much contingent on a set of circumstances. A bottle of water at Walmart is cheaper because there's a large supply of it, whereas a bottle of water in the desert, when it's the last one and you are literally dying of thirst, will fetch a much higher price because of the law of supply and demand. And so these basic aspects were ignored by Marxists and, by the way, continue to be ignored. And that obviously poses a big problem. But for the most part, traditional Marxism has been discredited. However, the Marxists realized, okay, traditional Marxism has been discredited for two reasons. First of all, capitalism has brought out of poverty more people than any other economic system in the history of mankind.
Writ large.
Right? Number one. And number two, thanks to capitalism, we have social mobility. So since we no longer can focus on this materialistic struggle, we have to find a new dialectic. And that is going to be found in characteristics that are immutable, be it skin color,
Height,
not really, but I mean, I'm still waiting for somebody to create the ideology to defend me from the people who oppress me because they're taller than me.
That's right.
Right?
You can get your knees extended.
Correct. But it's definitely about skin color, number one, right, and race and all its attributes, but also obviously sex, right, biological sex, and then gender ideology, which has been pushed over the last 15 years.
The one that got blowback in the 90s, intelligence.
Right. And of course, sexual orientation. Right. So it's important, again, to know what these items really mean and where they stem from so that people can actually have a critical view of them. And to this extent, I would suggest to our viewers that they read the books of thinkers like Antonio Gramsci, who introduced the idea of cultural hegemony and argued that capitalism maintains power by controlling culture. The Frankfurt School of the 1920s and 90s, all the way to the 60s, with thinkers like Marcuse, Adorno, Horkheimer, right? Who were the ones who reinterpreted Marxism through culture. And the modern critical theorists who apply Marxist power analysis to race, gender, and sexuality. All these ideas...
And literally, who studied with the founders of the Frankfurt School.
Correct. All these ideas threaten Western civilization because they undermine individualism and meritocracy, and they reduce people to identity groups, number one. They also promote a system of victimhood, right? Where people relinquish their personal responsibility and instead insist that whatever failures of their own are not their own, but of their group, and they are not brought about even by their group, but rather by the out
That's right.
group, by the other group. So it's never the Mexicans who come to this country illegally who are to blame for our failed state in Mexico, my country of birth, but rather it is the evil white American capitalist patriarchy that is keeping the Mexicans, lazy, ignorant, and corrupt.
Which is amazing because that's a totally different narrative than from the 90s and the aughts when Hillary Clinton, Bill Clinton, Barack Obama all sounded exactly like President Trump.
Correct.
Vis-a-vis the immigrants.
Correct.
Literally.
Quite correct. And also these cultural Marxist ideas encourage cancel culture, like we've seen over the last years, particularly during the Biden administration.
Very Maoist.
And ideological conformity, very much, yeah. James Lindsay is one of the authors that I really, really admire. And I've read many of his books, but I've also listened to many episodes of his podcast, right?
Yeah.
And he's always underlining the Maoist origins also of modern day wokeism. So then we have postmodernism and deconstructionism with thinkers like Michel Foucault, Jacques Derrida, and Jean-François Lyotard, who argued, Foucault, for example, that power structures shape knowledge and social norms, and he was just obsessed with finding power structures wherever you see in every single interaction. Yeah. The epitome of that type of worldview is basically a book like White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, where basically damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? You can't cure racism, basically, according to this race grifter.
Absolutely.
Because if you are aware of race, well, then you're a racist. If you say that you're not aware of racism, then you're definitely a racist. If you there's literally nothing that you can do to cure yourself of racism when the flawed argument of these people is that the systemic racism is absolutely pervasive across American society.
Which outlook has now led to hundreds and hundreds of mostly Caucasian women paying black women, black men to come to their houses at cost and berate them about how racist they are. Talk about a grift.
Right. Also, nobody mentions that Robin DiAngelo charges literally dozens of thousands of dollars to expose her ideas.
I think I got to get in on this.
Anti-Marxism. Yeah, we should. So these ideas, again, threaten Western civilization because they deny objective reality. They reject the Enlightenment values of reason, science, and progress. And they, again, encourage this identity-based oppression hierarchies.
Yeah. And it ignores the actual value of every human being.
Right.
That's the most dastardly part.
Right. So then we have critical theory and identity politics. So critical theory argues that society is structured by systemic oppression, where privileged groups, particularly white men who are heterosexual and, God forbid, Christian, suppress marginalized groups, right? So the thinkers there who are to be studied, not revered, but studied to be understood and debunked are people like Derek Bell, who was a pioneer of critical race theory, and who argued that racism is permanent in American institutions, and Kimberly Crenshaw, who developed the idea of intersectionality, which categorizes oppression based on multiple identity factors. Right?
Who studied directly under Marcuse.
Right. So what is the contribution of Kimberly Crenshaw? Well, she said, okay, you can be oppressed if you're a woman. And let's also, in fairness, acknowledge that decades ago, right, women were indeed oppressed.
Absolutely.
They did not have the same rights as men. Mm-hmm. They did not have the right to vote until however, and whatever year it was. I
1912,
can't
yeah.
think off the top of my head right now. They didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't go to university. They much earlier in the 1800s, they couldn't start a conversation lest they be considered immoral or whatever.
They had zero access to economic independence.
Correct. So, but all of that is long gone, and the reality is that under current circumstances, women enjoy the exact same rights as men. There is absolutely nothing that under the law a woman cannot do that a man can.
It's true.
If you can run for president, even if you do it unsuccessfully, like Hillary and Kamala, but you can do it, then it means that there's really nothing off the table, right?
And the things that the women can't do that men can do are exactly what people don't want to talk about.
Correct. But let's talk about that when we talk about radical feminism.
Yeah.
So Crenshaw's contribution was like, okay, you can be a victim of oppression and discrimination if you're a woman.
And she talks about
and
it
you
with
can
blacks.
also be a victim of oppression and discrimination if you're black.
Yep.
So if you're black and a woman, well, double whammy, you're, double oppressed.
Hence the intersection.
That's what intersectionality means, right? But we now get to a ridiculous situation where under the current woke orthodoxy, the most virtuous person is the most oppressed. And therefore, because they are the most oppressed and the most virtuous and the most victimized, they represent the absolute highest rung in this woke society.
Yep.
Right? So
And they don't even know it.
Right. So the ultimate unicorn for the woke is a pansexual, transsexual, morbidly obese. Oh wait, no, obese.
Wahhabite, extreme.
BIPOC, neurodivergent, Muslim, otherly abled, exactly, trans woman. I mean, where does it stop? And the reality is that none of these adjectives, none of these qualifiers, really have any meaning or any bearing at the end of the day in real life, in the market, in the free market, right? The fact that I'm Mexican, right, ethnically, doesn't make me better or less suitable for any particular job.
Right. Equal under the law.
Correct. Which means equal access to jobs as well. But I have to first prove that I am a qualified candidate, right? The fact that you are black and 1/4 Japanese doesn't also make you particularly, apt to do X, Y, Z. In fact, the fact that you're Japanese doesn't even really mean that you are Japanese at all. Do you speak the language? No. Right? So should you be the director of the Center for Japanese Studies here? No. Could a white person who has actually devoted their lives to the study of Japanese culture and the Japanese language, should they be director of such a center? Absolutely. Absolutely. And
But according to some, they don't have the lived experience. So
Correct.
They should back off.
Correct. Exactly. So this is where we currently are. This is a very, very dangerous and frankly, I mean, it's beyond stupid, right? But it's a very dangerous and very deeply entrenched idea in our field, which is music.
Yeah.
And this is how you get people, even in the highest spheres of our profession, at the Metropolitan Opera, in Covent Garden, and all these places, making ridiculous assertions such as you have to be a black woman in order to be able to sing Aida, or whatever, right? Or you have to be an Asian woman in order to sing Turandot or
Yeah,
Madame Butterfly.
Butterfly.
It's nonsense. You have to be able to sing these dauntingly difficult parts in order to be able to do them justice and do the music justice. That's all that matters.
Yep.
Because also, if we fragment these categories and humankind into these impossibly small categories, we end up in Schubladen, in tiroir in French. What is the word? I always forget this word in English. In Schublade, wie sagt man das auf
Schubladen.
Englisch? Drawers, in little drawers, in little boxes that prevent us from having anything in common with other people.
Yes.
And that also prevent us from really finding any even any resonance to the jobs that we are trying to fulfill.
And that's what I mean by it's the most dastardly thing that they're doing.
Right.
Because it takes us directly away from our humanity. What are you? You're not a human being. You're a Mexican, German,
Right, exactly.
vertically challenged.
Exactly. Whatever. Stop. I'm already literally shaking.
But all of those things, every single thing you add takes you farther and farther away from your humanity.
Correct. So anyway, we have then radical feminism and gender ideology. And again, it's not that the first wave of feminism or the second wave of feminism were wrong. Again, there were strides to be made.
Pioneers. People
Correct.
like
There were
Camille
pioneers
Paglia
and that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, it's interesting to see what happened in societies like the Nordic countries that are so fetishized by the American left, but particularly by people like Bernie Sanders and occasional cortex, right? So now let's talk about radical feminism and gender ideology. I'm obviously not going to say that feminism is wrong, right? The first wave of feminism, again, had its raison d'être, and it was important that women gain the same rights as men. Again, the right to vote, the right to educate themselves, to determine their own economic and financial futures, etc.
And also come into power as women.
Exactly.
What is a woman? They have their own set of skills. They're different than we are.
Correct.
So they come
correct.
into that.
And that's what's very, very important to talk about, because very few people pay attention to what feminism, decades of feminism, did in countries like the Nordic countries that are so fetishized by people in the left in America, particularly Bernie Sanders, and the one server that brings nothing to the table, Alexandra Occasional Cortex, right? These societies in Scandinavia, what did they show? Well, from the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, 90s, there was a push for actual social engineering in these countries, whereby sex quotas, and I don't mean the fun ones, but like, but sex quotas where you had to have 50-50 representation of women and men in the workplace were introduced. Well, first of all, what this means is that the realms in which there is a natural propensity for men to go into them and less so for women, STEM, right? The best qualified candidates were left out. Why? Because if you have to make room for 50% women in a field that is that mostly attracts men, by definition, you are going to have to take from the crème de la crème, from the top crop of male candidates, many good candidates in order to favor women who are less skilled or less adapted for these fields. But what's interesting is that in spite of all these efforts, or rather because these efforts were carried out over the years, we see a reversal towards what? Towards women preferring the professions that we typically associate with womanhood, right? So school teachers, nurses, and whatnot. And we see men, again, focusing primarily on engineering, mathematics.
And the shift back was absolutely organic.
Organic, exactly. So one of the reasons why feminism is wrong is because it negates biology and human nature.
And psychology, and we're psychologically different as well.
Correct. We are differently wired, and that's perfectly fine. We need that balance between men and women. If you look at all the philosophies of the East, that they are summarized in the idea of the yin and yang. It's not that yin is better than yang, right?
They're perfect complements to each other.
Perfect complements to each other, and we need them. We need them to have balance in life.
And the energies together are what creates a whole, a unity.
Right. And then, so this is the reason why the radical feminism of the latter years is so terrible. And in order to understand it, we need to understand the works of people like Simone de Beauvoir, who argued that one is not born a woman but becomes one. Where have I heard that? Right? Bud Light, anybody? Right? And Judith Butler, right? Who basically is one of the founders of queer theory, deconstructing gender norms. Radical feminism and gender ideology threaten Western civilization because they undermine traditional family structures, which are crucial for social stability. They reject biological reality, and they promote censorship of opposing views, classifying them as transphobic or sexist, right? So we got, over the last years, particularly under the Biden administration, to this ridiculous point where the hard-earned rights and prerogatives of women and girls, by extension, were sacrificed at the altar of transgenderism. Now, again, I'll go back to my original position or my original assumption or my belief, let me put it this way, that Americans are a profoundly decent bunch of people, and that they are loving and caring, and that they always will side with the underdog. Even if that underdog happens to be somebody who is in a position of disadvantage but has no good intentions.
Right.
And so,
you could consider it historically genetic, if that's a concept, because this nation is the first nation that was created by historical underdogs. We were the underdog 250 years ago.
right.
So that comes down through the lineage.
Right.
So we all still feel that.
Right.
But without question, and that's the problem.
Correct. And so, it's not that I don't understand the moral impulses of the left. I do. I am absolutely on board with not, attacking transgender people out of the blue or without provocation, or being mean to them or whatever.
I mean, dare I say, how many are you actually going to run into?
For one, right? But I actually have, my piano technician, who is a magician, basically, and the best in the city, if not the country, is transgender. And actually, in her case, I use the pronoun her, right? Because she had me fooled. For the longest time, I was like, oh, well, this is a woman. And I assumed as much for the longest time, until once talking about politics, she revealed to me, well, I'm actually transgender. And then we got to talk about politics, and it was very interesting to see that she actually agrees with my conservative viewpoints. Why? Because she says, first of all these guys with beards and, like Gatsad would say, 12-inch penises, right, who claim by fiat to be women from one day to the next, are basically doing a mockery of people like my piano technician.
It's minstralism.
Correct. Who literally went through years and years of struggles, of therapy, and of going through a sex change operation and blah, 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 as adults, by the way, as adults, they make a mockery of this. And why? They do it for all sorts of nefarious reasons. You have people like Leah Thomas, a mediocre swimmer that couldn't cut it in as a male swimmer and then decides, oh, well, I'm a woman, and then kicks everybody's ass as a woman. Well, duh. If you and I decide to be trans age, we will kick the asses of all the 16-year-olds trying to sing opera. Right. But that would be so blatantly unfair that nobody would come up with it, all right? Or nobody would put up with it, most importantly. But because people are so sheepish, and they just go along with whatever it is that the media puts in front of them, or academia, and they are not willing to confront it. Now you have had a generation or two that is incapable of even acknowledging what a woman is.
Yep.
Right? So, and again, it's not just about the medals.
And that's whether they believe it or not. They want to be seen as believing it.
Correct. And there's this video, for example, that I think is genius, of this guy approaching a black woman and saying like, oh, I defend you and your kind, trans women. And she's like, but I'm not trans. And it's like, no, I know that you're a biological woman too. It's like, no, but I'm not trans. And she's really making the point that I'm not trans. Well, duh. All of a sudden, when faced with the reality of somebody assuming wrongly that they are trans, women are very capable of knowing what they actually are.
Yep.
But they, for social capital, for brownie points amongst their woke friends, they come up with this nonsense of like, oh, I don't know. It's like not too long ago, people were like, I don't see race, I don't see color. It's like, well, are you colorblind? Because you and I are certainly a different shade of brown, right? Or like my sister would say, I'm beige.
Beige.
Right? It's nonsense.
It's absolute nonsense.
It's denying a reality that anybody with two working sets of eyes, well, actually, no, wait, one working set of two eyes can see. Come on. And again, it goes beyond just taking medals away from women, but actually puts women in danger, girls in danger.
Yes.
So again, because the woke are like bleeding hearts and like, oh, our poor transgender friends, they ignore the fact that there might be men, biological men, posing as transgender in order to rape girls in locker rooms, right? Or just be voyeur, deprived criminals in women's and girls' bathrooms and locker rooms and whatnot. Or you have had many cases of men who are convicted of crimes, then identify conveniently as women, are put in women's prisons, and then rape the female prisoners. Luckily, Trump has put an end to this. Mm-hmm. I mean, like I always say, I don't take credit away from the Republicans, and certainly not away from President Trump. But the last election was not just a victory of Trump and the Republicans, but a referendum and a defeat of all this nonsense promoted by the woke left that completely hijacked the Democrat Party and that goes against common sense, biology, and justice and decency.
I mean, such that even a few of their talking heads had to admit it on live television. Van Jones, one of the famous ones.
Right.
Black, etc.
Right.
He said, look, this was the second time. We need to stop blaming it on the conservatives, on Trump, on them. We need to look at ourselves. We need to look at how we lost our voter base. This was our fault. Of course, he should have said the obvious thing, but he didn't.
Right.